I will try to keep this as objective and general as I can, since first of all, this channel is one focused on games, and while the recent Charlie incident really affected me on a deeply human level, I will not comment on it from a political point of view, as again, this channel is focused on games. And to be honest, this isn't really a left or right sentiment, since this concept of separating the art from the artist has been thrown around from both sides of the political aisle and for various mediums of art, not just games. But for this video, I will mostly focus on the recent behavior from game devs, and let's be honest, we are sure to hear this phrase a lot in the next few months from a lot of fans, studios, and PR teams, since many devs and other people who work in the entertainment industry joined the club of people who had some of the most vile and frankly just dishonorably, ungodly, inhumanly, and wickedly evil reactions to the literal end of a man's life. I am of course talking about the vile reactions to the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk, and this fake sophism is about to become hollower than ever, as the statement sounds like a lake but has the depth of a paddle. Separating the art from the artist is something impossible to do for basically everyone, to be honest. Humans are intrinsically emotional creatures, so how things and people make us feel have an immediate effect on whether we will or will not like said things and people in general. Being a Christian myself, I could sit here and list you a bunch of Bible verses as to why this is not only impossible to do, but also immoral and even irresponsible to do as well. But I will also refrain from bringing religion into this, for this video at least, as I know when one brings religion into arguments, people who do not believe in God tend to disregard the argument, as well as the person bringing forth said argument altogether. But the fact of the matter though is that this still remains an impossible, immoral, and even irresponsible thing to do, even when both religion and politics are taken out of the equation. So in this video, I'll basically focus on the biology behind why this is impossible to do. Then I will talk about the fact that there is a time and a place to express certain views, before moving on to some things being plainly immoral, to be honest. Lastly, I will, as always, give my final thoughts on this matter. People are emotional creatures, whether we like it or not. The areas of the brain responsible for emotion and memory retention work in tandem to create long-lasting memories that we will not forget as easily as memories that were just neutral to us with no significant emotional reaction attached to them. In other words, things we consider incredibly important in our lives, we will remember for a much longer time than things that we didn't consider as important or as emotionally impactful as others. I won't get too technical so as not to bore people, but the two areas I'm talking about here are the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for emotional processing, decision making, our emotional memory formation, our behavior, and so on, helps our hippocampus, the part of the brain that is responsible for both our short and long-term memories, which of course is also responsible for helping us learn new things, store and later recollect things that are of emotional importance to us. This is why a smell or a thing or a dish will take you back to a time you considered valuable. Why, when a significant world event is mentioned, you can still remember the exact time you heard of it and the exact place you were when you learned it had happened. And why remembering a lost loved one can still make you cry long after you've lost them. Because strong emotions and memory are just so incredibly intertwined. We are simply built this way. So how are you supposed to enjoy something from a person you have associated with strong negative emotions? You simply cannot do it. Don't get me wrong, some people can somewhat do it, but those are very few and very specific people. But for the average Joe and Jane, it's not that easy. It's why leftists suddenly started hating Harry Potter when J.K. Rowling started stating biological facts, and why gamers hated Dragon Age the Veilguard for inserting modern-day, nonsensical, gender-studied drivel in a medieval fantasy world. Because said works of art represent something that was created by a person whose values, beliefs, and sociopolitical views we either do not agree with or worse, find downright deplorable. As you can tell, I hated Dragon Age the Veilguard for the gender study drivel and for what it did to the Dragon Age franchise as a whole, since it was a game I had associated with strong positive emotions from my childhood. I still played Dragon Age the Veilguard, however, so when I try to remember anything from it, everything is awful in my mind. I don't remember anything worthwhile about it, I can't even remember the name of certain characters or events or quests and so on. But I do remember the awful scenes because I hated them so much. So the game did make a lasting impression on me, but for all the wrong reasons. Now, should a new Dragon Age game come out, or should these same people make a new game, chances are I won't want to play their game in the first place, but I will also not want to support them in any way again, exactly because the most vivid memory I have of theirs is something very, very negative. And let's not forget that this emotionally driven liking and disliking of things and people is something artists themselves are doing as well. And you can see what or who they like or dislike based on how they choose to portray said group, said movement, said people or person, etc. in their art. So how can one separate the art from the artist when in fact the artists themselves use their art to express not only themselves but their political leanings and views as well? Sometimes artists also try to bring attention to something and raise awareness about it through their art, or create it as a tribute to something or someone, or use it as a vessel to push their own views and agendas and so on. And many a times artists want us to see them and their ideas in their work, and it is not uncommon for them to use their art to express things they cannot put into words. In other words, art is a byproduct of the artist's imagination, life experiences, their views on sociopolitical issues, how they view the world, what they'd like the world to be like, and so much more. So these type of platitudes about separating the art from the artist are just that. It is simply a cliché, dull, and frankly banal statement that sounds great in theory, but does not and cannot work in practice for most people, since emotions dictate a lot of what we will or will not like anyway. However, I do get the artist's point of view of, them wanting to express themselves through their work, or even them wanting to attempt to change the world through their work. However, there is a time and a place to do so. If, for example, you're a small, independent artist, then by all means, do, say, and act however you want to, as your actions and words will only come back to bite you and affect only your paycheck. If, however, you are part of a large team hired by a big company, then keep your views out of the art, because it's not your art. You're but a small cog in the machine creating said art, and your stupid comments or opinions about a thing nobody even asked your opinion on will not only cost you your paycheck, but everyone else's on the team as well. And if you do open your mouth regardless, then do not act surprised when you are fired. What is more, you cannot expect people who do not like what you stand for, what you do, what you support, how you conduct yourself, what you are trying to promote, what your values are as a person, if you have any, and how you are as a person outside of your art, to then just come and support you by buying said art. Because why would they? Why would anyone support something or someone they either disagree with or find outright reprehensible? Why would they help you make money so that you can promote even more of what they dislike? It just doesn't make any sense. At the same time, studios need to realize who they are hiring and the risks they're taking on by hiring some people. And in my opinion, they already do, but just choose to go for easy money, and they basically hurt themselves in the long run instead. Because if you hire someone who is basically a political activist just so you can claim brownie points for your diverse and vocal hires, then do not act surprised when they do what they do best and end up destroying your reputation and ultimately your gain and earnings as well. Firing them after the fact doesn't make things better either, because it was you who hired them to begin with, so that says a lot about your choices, morals, and values as a studio scenario as well. You traded in your morals, decency and standards for some pointless brownie points with whatever a fringe political group believes in on that particular day of the week. And I'm guessing some sweet ESG money as well. So I'm sorry, but firing a person whose opinions you knew beforehand, because let's be honest guys, all employers go through people's social media nowadays, it doesn't make things better at all. You only fired them because of the uproar and in an effort to save face and hopefully yourself as well from financial ruin, not because you fundamentally disagree with their behavior and views, because if you did, you wouldn't have hired them in the first place. So spare us your fake outrage and PR-approved apologies. So we took religion and politics out of the equation from the get-go. Now let's try to take emotion out of it as well. We can't fully take it out, of course, since, as previously mentioned, it is kind of impossible to do, but let us just entertain the idea of simple, common decency for a second here. Common decency has unfortunately become anything but common nowadays, just like common sense. Of course, what common decency is differs from culture to culture. However, there are some things that I believe to be universal. Not celebrating someone's death, for example, is one of the most basic rules of common decency that many seem to have forgotten about. And look, we may disagree with one another on many things, from the most important of issues to the most trivial ones, but at the end of the day, we are all still human. People with families, friends, loved ones, and so on, who will all mourn us when we are gone, and the very least we can do is have some respect. If not for the person who is no longer with us, then for the people mourning their son, their daughter, their father, their mother, their brother, their sister, whatever. To you, the person might have been the worst person ever, just like you are said villain in someone else's story. What makes a villain evil, though, is not what others think about them, but how they themselves act, and ultimately by how people will remember them. And you're actively choosing to be remembered by how hateful you are, by how opportunistic, self-serving, unkind, inconsiderate, disrespectful, and heartless you really are, by taking advantage of a literal tragedy to come off as a pseudo-intellectual rebel whose delusions of grandeur and self-importance all stem from a false sense of self-proclaimed intellectual and moral superiority, just like any other villain. And if you're so above it all, so different from all the other villains of the world, so righteous and true, so honest, so morally and intellectual superior, so sure about standing on the right side of things, why are you acting in this way? Because I've seen many of these people claim that it's different, because the person they're mocking would actually do the same to them if the roles were reversed. So it's okay. So let me get this straight. The person you've made your personal villain acts in a way you hate. So it's okay for you to act like the person you consider a villain because you're assuming they would do the same to you as well. So in a way, you at least admit that you're the same person you think you hate then, locked in this perpetual cycle of self-hatred that you only think of as hatred for another person, group, or idea. To me, these kind of people are deeply disturbed and hurt people who are in need of help and guidance, as they seem to be completely lost. Seemingly immature children mad at the world for not bending over backwards to appease their demands, throwing tantrums when they don't get their way, and viewing anyone who disagrees with them as villains. Words do not a villain make. Behavior, character, choices, actions, as well as reactions do, however. So how can anyone ask of people to forget someone like this is involved in the product they're asked to support? No matter the person's religious beliefs or lack thereof, some things just cross a universally abhorrent line. So in my opinion, it is not only immoral to support such artists and the art they're involved in, but also irresponsible as well, because then you're endorsing such behavior, showing such people that their actions have no consequences, and that will only lead to even more things and statements like this, if not worse, in the future. So a line needs to be drawn. You not only cannot, but also should not separate the art from the artist, because that will affect not only future art, but also what we consider okay and decent to do, say, and act like. Will Durant summarized Aristotle's sentiment about excellence and virtue being a byproduct of habit with this incredible quote: "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." And what this kind of people repeatedly choose to do is speaking volumes about their character. And why would I, or anyone else with any common decency and heart, ever want to support someone like that in any way, shape, or form? So in my opinion, separating the artist from the art is just that, a statement. A hollow sophism that most people aren't likely to be able to put in practice. An artist's views, words, beliefs, politics, and so on will always influence how we view them and consequently their art as well. Whether this influence is going to help us see the artist's creation in a more positive or negative light ultimately lies in personal values, beliefs, politics, etc. What one may find acceptable, another may not, because of each person's individual beliefs and values. So it's in the artist's hands to decide whether inserting their own views in their art is ultimately worth the financial and also moral risk or not. They can choose which side they want to appease and appeal to, or even anger, or they can choose to focus on making people escape from said everyday issues and choose to entertain them instead of trying to preach at them or educate them with what they think are the right views and opinions to have. Either way, some things are universally immoral and reprehensible and should never be thought of as normal. But it all ultimately boils down to choice. A choice made by both the artists themselves and the consumers of their art, and what they all feel comfortable with supporting.